The rain started just as the bus pulled away from the curb, thin streaks tapping against the windows like fingers trying to get someone's attention. She sat near the back, a small overnight bag tucked between her feet, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together required physical effort. Her name, according to the ticket, was Emily Carter, and she was supposed to be traveling from a quiet town in northern Nevada to visit her sister across state lines. It was a simple trip, the kind people make every day without thinking twice: a few hours on a bus, a change of scenery, a short break from routine. The driver remembered her because she thanked him twice when she boarded, her voice soft, almost distracted, as if her mind was already somewhere else. Other passengers would later say she looked tired but not distressed, the kind of tired that comes from too many sleepless nights, not from fear. No one on that bus had any reason to think they were watching the last ordinary moments of her life for months to come. Somewhere along the highway, the landscape shifted from wet asphalt and gas stations to long stretches of empty road, bordered by scrubland and distant hills. Emily sat quietly, occasionally glancing at her phone, though records would later show no calls were made and no messages were sent after the bus left the station. At one rest stop, she stepped off with a few other passengers, bought a bottle of water, and stood outside for a moment, staring at the horizon longer than necessary. A security camera caught her leaning against a concrete pillar, her face turned slightly away, her expression unreadable. It would be the last confirmed image of her as the woman everyone knew. When the bus pulled back onto the road, she was still on board, still in her seat, still just another traveler heading somewhere familiar. But at some point after that, without any alarm, without any obvious struggle, Emily Carter vanished into the space between one state and the next. Her family didn't panic at first. A delayed bus, a dead phone battery, a missed connection, all of it seemed reasonable. Hours passed, then a full day and still no word. Her sister called the bus company, then local hospitals, then the police, each call tightening the knot in her chest. The official report would later state that Emily was last seen traveling across state lines, destination unknown beyond what was written on her ticket. Search efforts began slowly, then with growing urgency as days turned into weeks. Posters went up at truck stops, rest areas, border towns, and small diners along the route. Her face became familiar to people who had never met her, a smiling photo taken at a family barbecue now reduced to a grainy printout taped to bulletin boards. Investigators traced her phone, her bank cards, her social media, finding nothing after that final rest stop. It was as if she had stepped off the map entirely, swallowed by the thin, invisible line that separates one state from another. And then, months later, on a cold morning at a border checkpoint, a woman matching Emily's description appeared on foot, confused, exhausted, and unable to tell anyone who she was, where she had been, or how she had gotten there. The officers at the checkpoint noticed her because she didn't move like most travelers. Cars rolled through in steady lines, drivers handing over documents with practiced motions, but she stood off to the side near a concrete barrier, clutching the strap of her bag with both hands, watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. At first they thought she might be waiting for someone, but as minutes passed, it became clear she was simply standing there, shivering slightly in a thin jacket that wasn't warm enough for the early morning cold. When one of the agents approached and asked if she needed help, she hesitated too long before answering. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. She said she wasn't sure, not sure where she was, not sure where she was going, not even sure why she was there at all. They brought her inside, offered her water, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Routine questions followed: name, date of birth, address. Each one seemed to confuse her more. She stared at the floor, then at her hands, as if the answers might be written on her skin. Finally, when shown a list of missing persons that included Emily Carter's photo, her reaction was immediate, but not in the way anyone expected. She didn't cry with recognition or gasp in shock. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying the picture as if it belonged to a stranger who looked oddly familiar. "She looks like me," she said after a long pause, her voice steady but distant. It was the kind of statement that made the room go quiet. The agents exchanged glances, understanding all at once that this wasn't just a lost traveler. This was someone who had crossed more than just a physical border. Fingerprinting confirmed what her blank stare could not. The woman was Emily Carter, the missing college student whose face had stared out from posters and online alerts for months, was now sitting in a small, brightly lit room, unable to recognize her own name. When they told her, gently, who she was, she listened politely, the way someone listens to a story that doesn't quite make sense. She asked to see the photo again, then another, as if repetition might unlock something buried deep in her mind. Nothing did. Her memories, at least the ones that mattered, were gone. She could describe the room she was in, the color of the agent's uniform, the hum of the overhead lights, but she couldn't tell them how she had gotten there or what had happened after she boarded that bus. News traveled fast. Within hours, her family was notified, and within a day, her disappearance had shifted from a missing persons case to something far more unsettling. Reporters began to call it a miracle and a mystery in the same breath. Found alive, but without her memory, stranded at a border she didn't remember crossing. When her sister arrived, the reunion was not the tearful embrace everyone had imagined during the long months of waiting. Emily looked at her with polite confusion, her eyes searching for something that should have been there but wasn't. Her sister hugged her anyway, holding on as if the physical act might somehow bring the lost pieces back. Emily stood still in her arms, not pushing away, but not fully returning the embrace either. It was in that moment that everyone realized the worst part of her disappearance might not be where she had been, but what she had lost along the way. Back in the hospital room, where doctors ran quiet tests and nurses spoke in calm, careful tones, Emily became the center of a storm of questions she couldn't answer. Neurologists asked her to count backward, to identify familiar objects, to read short paragraphs and explain their meaning. She passed most of these easily, which only made the gaps in her memory more disturbing. Her mind worked, her speech was clear, her reactions were normal, but the timeline of her own life had been erased beyond a few vague impressions that felt more like dreams than memories. She knew what a bus was, what a state border meant, how to tie her shoes and hold a conversation, but she didn't remember her college campus, her dorm room, her favorite coffee shop, or the friends she used to text every day. When shown photos of herself with classmates, she studied them carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle, but the faces never turned into people she felt she knew. Investigators returned, gently at first, then with more focused questions. They wanted to know if she remembered stopping anywhere, meeting anyone, getting into another vehicle, arguing with someone, anything at all that could explain how she vanished between one rest stop and a border checkpoint hundreds of miles away. Emily listened, nodding, trying to cooperate, but every question ended the same way. She would close her eyes for a moment, her brow tightening with effort, then shake her head. Nothing. The last clear thing she could recall was the sound of rain on the bus windows and the feeling of the seat vibrating beneath her as the engine hummed. After that, her memory dropped into a blank space, a stretch of time that simply did not exist for her. Doctors suggested dissociative amnesia, a condition often linked to extreme stress or trauma, where the mind protects itself by sealing away painful memories. The explanation made sense on paper, but it raised more questions than it answered. What kind of trauma could be so severe that it erased months of a young woman's life? And why had she ended up at a border, alone, confused, and physically exhausted, with no clear signs of injury? Her clothes were worn but not torn, her shoes scuffed, as if she had walked long distances, but there were no obvious marks of violence. Blood tests showed dehydration and fatigue, nothing more. It was as if she had been surviving somewhere, somehow, but in a way that left no easy trail to follow. Her family tried to fill in the blanks for her, bringing photo albums, telling stories, pointing out places on maps. They spoke of her childhood, her love of hiking, her plans for after graduation. Emily listened with polite interest, sometimes smiling at a funny story, sometimes growing quiet when the conversation touched on moments she should have remembered. There were brief flashes that unsettled everyone. Once, while looking at a picture of a highway cutting through open land, she went pale and asked for the photo to be put away. She couldn't explain why, only that it made her chest feel tight, like something bad had happened there. Another time, she woke in the middle of the night, trembling, insisting she could hear trucks passing, even though the hospital room was silent. These moments suggested that her mind still held something, buried deep, pressing against the surface, but refusing to fully emerge. As days passed, the initial relief of finding her alive gave way to a heavier, more complicated reality. Emily had returned, but she had not truly come back. The border had not just separated two states for her, it had marked a dividing line in her life, a before and an after, with the middle missing entirely. And while investigators continued to search for answers in phone records, traffic cameras, and witness reports, Emily sat in a hospital bed, staring out the window, trying to remember a life that everyone else insisted was hers. The mystery was no longer just where she had gone. It was what had happened to her in the space where her memory should have been. When Emily was finally released from the hospital, the world outside felt too loud, too fast, as if it had kept moving while she had been suspended somewhere beyond time. Her sister drove her back to their hometown, pointing out familiar landmarks along the way, hoping something might spark recognition. A diner they used to visit, a small bridge where they once took photos at sunset, the turnoff to the college campus where Emily had spent most of her adult life. Emily watched everything pass by through the car window with quiet focus, her eyes tracking each sign and building, but none of it settled into place. It felt, she later said, like watching a movie set in someone else's life. The places were real, the details were clear, but the emotional connection simply wasn't there. She knew, intellectually, that she was supposed to belong to these spaces. Emotionally, they were strangers to her. At home, her old bedroom waited exactly as she had left it. Posters on the wall, textbooks on a shelf, a half-finished sketch pinned to a corkboard. Her sister opened drawers, showing her clothes, jewelry, small personal items, hoping that touch might trigger memory. Emily ran her fingers over familiar fabrics, picked up a necklace she had apparently worn every day, and turned it over in her hands with curiosity. "It's pretty," she said softly, as if commenting on something she might buy in a store. The sentence hit her family harder than any tears could have. This was proof, in the simplest words, that she had lost not just memories, but ownership of her own past. Investigators continued to press gently, asking her to retrace her final known movements. They laid out timelines, maps, and photos from rest stops and highway cameras. Emily tried to follow along, tracing the route with her finger, but it felt abstract, like planning a trip she had never taken. One image, however, caused a noticeable shift. A grainy still from a gas station camera showed a woman who looked like her standing near the edge of the frame, partially turned away, as if speaking to someone just outside the camera's view. Emily stared at it for a long time. Her breathing changed, becoming shallow and uneven. She pointed to the empty space beside herself in the photo and whispered, "There was someone there." When asked who or what they looked like, she shook her head, frustrated tears filling her eyes. She couldn't see a face. She could only feel a presence, heavy and close, like someone standing too near. That small breakthrough only deepened the mystery. Who had been with her? Why had no one else reported seeing her with anyone? The bus company had no record of her getting off early. There were no credit card charges, no hotel stays, no phone pings to suggest where she might have gone. It was as if she had stepped into a shadow between known places, traveling in a way that left almost no trace. The theory of voluntary disappearance was briefly considered, but her condition made it unlikely. People who choose to vanish usually have a plan, a new identity, a reason. Emily had neither. She had confusion, fear, and a mind that seemed to have locked away something it could not safely face. At night, the fragments grew stronger. Emily began to have vivid dreams that felt too real to be random. She would wake up sweating, convinced she had been walking for hours along a long stretch of road, the sound of engines rushing past her, wind tugging at her jacket. In one dream, she stood near a fence or barrier, lights flashing in the distance, voices calling out in a language she couldn't quite understand. She would describe these dreams in the morning, embarrassed, apologizing for not being more helpful, but her family and the investigators listened closely. Even if her conscious mind refused to open the door, her subconscious seemed to be knocking from the other side, trying to push something through. The more time passed, the clearer it became that Emily's return was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by where she had gone, but by what her mind was protecting her from. Somewhere between that rainy bus ride and the cold concrete of the border checkpoint, something had happened that changed her in a way no one could yet fully understand. And as she sat in her childhood home, surrounded by pieces of a life she no longer remembered, the question that haunted everyone remained unanswered. What had Emily seen or experienced that her own memory refused to let her remember. As weeks turned into months, the attention around Emily slowly faded from breaking news to quiet concern, but for her family, the story was far from over. Life settled into a strange routine where every day felt both familiar and completely new to her. She enrolled in light therapy sessions, met regularly with a psychologist, and tried to rebuild a sense of identity from the stories others told about her. Friends from college came to visit, bringing inside jokes, photos from parties, and memories of late-night study sessions. They laughed, hoping the sound might trigger something. Emily laughed too, politely, but it was the laughter of someone listening to a story, not reliving it. Each visit ended the same way, with hugs that felt one-sided and the quiet realization that knowing someone's history is not the same as remembering it. Therapy sessions dug carefully into the blank space. The psychologist asked her to focus on sensations instead of memories. The smell of gasoline, the sound of tires on wet pavement, the hum of fluorescent lights, the feeling of cold air on her face. Some of these caused subtle reactions. Her shoulders would tense. Her hands would clench without her noticing. Once, when asked to imagine standing on the side of a highway at night, she abruptly pulled her knees to her chest and said she felt unsafe, though she couldn't explain why. These reactions suggested that while her conscious mind held nothing, her body still remembered something. Trauma, the therapist explained, often lives in the nervous system even when the memory itself is locked away. Investigators continued to work in the background, quietly following leads that went nowhere. A truck driver thought he might have given a ride to someone who looked like her, but he couldn't be sure. A motel clerk remembered a young woman checking in without ID, but records were incomplete and the description was vague. Each possible sighting raised hope for a moment, only to collapse under closer scrutiny. Emily listened to these updates with a strange mix of curiosity and detachment. It was unsettling to hear strangers describe versions of her moving through places she couldn't picture, living moments she couldn't claim as her own. There were moments when frustration broke through her calm exterior. One afternoon, after yet another therapy session that ended with more questions than answers, she snapped. She slammed her hand against the table and asked out loud why everyone cared so much about what she couldn't remember. The room went silent. Then she began to cry, not loudly, but in a quiet, exhausted way that carried months of confusion. She said it felt like everyone was trying to force her back into a life she didn't recognize, into a person she didn't feel like. The border, she said, felt like a reset point. Everything before it belonged to someone else. Everything after it belonged to her. The statement frightened her family more than any missing memory ever had. Small, unsettling details also began to surface. Emily developed a habit of checking doors and windows repeatedly before going to bed, even though she couldn't say why. Loud trucks passing the house late at night made her flinch. She refused to stand near busy roads, insisting on walking farther to avoid them. When asked about these behaviors, she shrugged and said they just felt necessary. It was as if her mind had erased the story but left behind the emotional punctuation, the fear, the caution, the instinct to avoid certain situations. These habits were clues, but they were fragments without context, pieces of a puzzle without the picture on the box. One evening, while flipping through old photos alone, Emily found a picture of herself standing at a state welcome sign during a family road trip years earlier. She stared at it for a long time. Her expression in the photo was happy, carefree, one hand resting on the sign, the other giving a thumbs up. Something about it made her chest tighten. "I don't like borders," she said quietly when her sister walked into the room. The words surprised both of them. When asked why, Emily shook her head. She didn't know. She only knew that the idea of crossing from one place to another made her uneasy, as if something important could be lost in the process. By this point, it was clear that Emily's disappearance was not just a missing persons case with a strange ending. It had become a psychological mystery, one where the truth might be buried not in police files or surveillance footage, but deep inside her own mind. Everyone wanted answers. Investigators wanted a timeline. Her family wanted closure. The public wanted a story that made sense. But Emily lived in a reality where the most important part of the story was missing, and no amount of searching outside could replace what had been locked away within her. The silence around her lost time was no longer just a gap in memory. It had become a presence in her life, shaping her fears, her habits, and her sense of self in ways no one could fully see. By the time the case reached its first anniversary since Emily's return, the official investigation had quietly stalled. Files were still open, but there were no new leads, no fresh sightings, no breakthrough in phone or financial records. To the outside world, the story had become one of those strange human interest mysteries that people half remembered, a headline about a woman found at a border with no memory. For Emily, it was not a story at all. It was her daily reality. She had moved back into her parents' home, not because she needed constant care, but because the world outside still felt slightly unreal to her, as if she were walking through a version of life that had been built for someone else. She tried to reclaim small pieces of independence. She drove short distances, at first with someone in the passenger seat, then alone. She went to a nearby cafe and forced herself to sit by the window, watching cars pass, listening to conversations, trying to feel normal. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the low rumble of traffic would suddenly make her heart race for no clear reason, and she would have to leave, pretending she had forgotten something important. These moments embarrassed her, even though everyone around her insisted she had nothing to be ashamed of. She hated how fragile she felt, how easily her body reacted to things her mind could not explain. There were also moments of eerie familiarity. Once, while driving through a rural stretch of road, she instinctively slowed near a rundown gas station, even though she had no memory of ever being there. The place felt heavy to her, charged with something she couldn't name. She parked across the street, staring at the flickering sign, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her pulse hammered in her ears. She didn't go inside. She just sat there, breathing, until the feeling passed. Later, when she described it to her therapist, the therapist gently suggested that her brain might be reacting to a place connected to her lost time. The idea both intrigued and terrified her. It meant that pieces of the truth might be scattered all around her, visible but unreachable. Her dreams became more vivid, not clear memories but fragments, long stretches of road under dark sky, the glow of headlights cutting through rain, the low murmur of voices she couldn't understand. Sometimes she dreamed of standing in a wide, empty field, unsure which direction to go, while distant engines rumbled somewhere beyond her sight. She would wake up with her heart pounding, the images fading almost immediately, leaving behind only a sense of dread and urgency. These dreams were the closest thing she had to a narrative, and yet they were too broken to form a story. Her family noticed subtle changes in her personality. She was quieter than before, more cautious, less impulsive. The old Emily, they said, had been adventurous, quick to say yes to trips and late-night plans. The new Emily weighed every decision carefully, as if something deep inside her was always calculating risk. She listened to people more than she spoke. She watched doors, exits, windows. It was not paranoia in a clinical sense, but it was a constant, low-level vigilance, the kind that comes from someone who has learned, without remembering how, that the world can become dangerous without warning. At one point, a private investigator hired by a journalist contacted the family with a theory. He believed Emily may have been picked up by someone offering help, someone who moved her across several states, keeping her isolated and dependent, possibly under manipulation rather than overt force. The theory fit some of the psychological patterns, but there was no proof, no witness, no location, no person of interest. The idea that someone could have controlled part of her life for months or longer, leaving no clear trace, unsettled everyone. For Emily, it was especially disturbing. She couldn't decide whether it was worse to imagine being hurt or to imagine being convinced, slowly and quietly, to go along with something she didn't understand. She began to keep a journal, writing down everything she felt, every strange reaction, every dream, every place that triggered unease. It was her way of building a new timeline, even if the old one remained lost. Some days she wrote pages. Other days she wrote nothing at all, staring at the blank paper as if it mirrored the blank space in her mind. The journal became proof that even if her past was fractured, her present was real. She was here. She was alive. She was moving forward, even if she didn't know where she had been. Still, the unanswered questions hovered over everything. Who had she been with? Where had she slept? How had she survived? And most unsettling of all, What had happened that her mind had decided was too dangerous to remember. The border had given her back to her family, but it had not given her back her story. And as time went on, Emily began to understand something deeply unsettling. It was possible that the truth was not just forgotten. It was being actively held back by her own mind, like a locked door she could sense but could not open, no matter how badly she wanted to know what was on the other side. As the second year after Emily's return approached, a quiet shift began to take place inside her. It wasn't a sudden breakthrough or a dramatic recovery. It was more like a slow pressure building behind the locked door in her mind. Small things started to connect in ways they hadn't before. A certain type of truck horn on the highway would make her flinch, and she realized it was the same sound she often heard in her dreams. The smell of cheap motel soap in a public restroom once made her dizzy, forcing her to sit down. These were not memories, but they were patterns, and patterns suggested a hidden structure beneath the blankness. Her therapist encouraged her to gently explore these reactions instead of avoiding them. They practiced grounding techniques, helping her stay in the present when her body reacted to something from the past. During one session, while focusing on the sound of rain outside the office window, Emily suddenly said, very quietly, that she felt like she was supposed to be somewhere else when it rained. The words came out before she could think about them. She covered her mouth, surprised by herself. When asked to explain, she couldn't. The feeling was there, strong and emotional, but the image behind it was still missing. A breakthrough of sorts came from an unexpected place. One evening, while watching a true crime documentary with her family, there was a brief segment about long-haul truck routes and informal rest stops used by drivers. The screen showed aerial shots of wide highways, isolated pull-offs, and small roadside motels. Emily felt her breathing change. Her palms became damp. She muted the television without realizing she was doing it. Her mother noticed and asked if she was okay. Emily stared at the dark screen and said, "For the first time, I think I was moved around a lot." The statement wasn't a memory. It was a conclusion her body seemed to have reached before her mind did. This idea began to shape how everyone looked at the case. Investigators revisited trucking routes, cross-border freight schedules, and small motels near highways. It was still mostly guesswork, but it gave a direction to the emptiness. For Emily, it gave a strange sense of validation. The fear she felt around highways, trucks, and roadside places suddenly made more sense. Even without images or names, her reactions suggested a life that had existed in motion, a life lived between places, never fully settled anywhere. Emotionally, this period was the hardest for her. Knowing that something was there, something structured enough to leave consistent reactions, made the absence more painful. She became frustrated with her own mind. In moments of exhaustion, she would say she wished she could just remember everything at once, no matter how bad it was, just to make the uncertainty stop. Her therapist cautioned her that the mind often releases traumatic memories slowly for a reason. Remembering too much, too fast, could be overwhelming. Emily understood this logically, but emotionally, she felt trapped between wanting to know and being afraid of what knowing might do to her. Her relationships also shifted. Some friends drifted away, unsure how to connect with someone who felt so different from the person they remembered. Others stayed, adapting to the new Emily, learning to accept that she might never fully become who she used to be. Emily herself grieved for that version of her life, even though she couldn't remember it. She mourned the lost years, the experiences she never got to consciously live, the growth that had been stolen from her in ways she couldn't define. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning something invisible but undeniably real. Late one night, unable to sleep, Emily stood by her bedroom window watching rain streak down the glass. The distant sound of traffic carried through the air. Instead of panic, she felt a heavy sadness. She whispered to herself that somewhere out there, on roads she couldn't name and in places she couldn't see, a version of her had existed that she would never fully meet. That version had survived something. That version had crossed a border not just between states, but between who she was and who she had become. By now, it was clear that Emily's story was not building toward a neat revelation. There would likely be no single moment where everything snapped back into place. The truth, whatever it was, seemed to live in fragments, in sensations, in fears, in half-formed thoughts. And yet, for the first time, Emily felt that she was getting closer to the edges of it, not close enough to see it clearly, but close enough to know it was there. The silence in her mind was no longer empty. It was full of pressure, full of something waiting, and whether she was ready or not, it felt as if that something was slowly, inevitably, trying to come back. Whenever you're ready, ask for the final part. In the months that followed, Emily came to understand that her life would likely never be divided cleanly into before and after in the way her family or the public might want. There would be no courtroom confession, no hidden bunker, no single villain whose face could explain everything. What she carried instead was something quieter and in many ways heavier. It was the knowledge that a part of her life had existed beyond her reach, shaped by forces she could sense but not name, and that this missing time would always be a shadow at the edge of her identity. One afternoon, during a long therapy session, Emily reached a point of emotional exhaustion. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at the carpet, tracing the pattern with her eyes. Then she said something that surprised even her. She said that maybe her mind wasn't broken. Maybe it was protecting her in the only way it knew how. The therapist didn't argue with her. Instead, they talked about survival, about how the brain sometimes locks away experiences not to erase them, but to allow a person to keep functioning, to keep living. The idea didn't give Emily her memories back, but it gave her something else. It gave her permission to stop treating the blank space as a failure. She began to shift her focus from trying to recover what was lost to building what came next. She returned to school part-time, choosing classes carefully, moving at a pace that felt safe. She volunteered at a local community center, helping with simple tasks, interacting with people who knew nothing about her story. In those moments, she was just Emily, not a headline, not a mystery, not a woman found at a border with no memory. The simplicity of that role was a kind of healing. It reminded her that even without a full past, she still had a present. There were still hard days, days when a passing truck would make her heart jump, days when the sight of a roadside motel in a movie would make her throat tighten, days when she would look at old photos and feel a hollow ache for a life she could not emotionally access. But there were also new memories now, real ones, sitting in a cafe laughing at something genuinely funny, walking through a park in the early morning, feeling cold air in her lungs, finishing a class and realizing she was proud of herself. These moments did not replace what was missing, but they began to balance it. Her family learned slowly to stop asking when her memory would come back. They stopped waiting for a miracle moment where she would suddenly remember everything. Instead, they started to accept the Emily who stood in front of them, not the daughter or sister they had lost, and not exactly the one they had found, but someone shaped by both loss and survival. Their love became less about restoring the past and more about supporting the future. Years later, when people occasionally recognized her name from old news stories, Emily would politely decline to go into detail. She learned that she did not owe anyone her trauma, even if she could one day remember it. The border would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her entire identity. It was a line she had crossed, not a place she had to live in forever. In quiet moments, she sometimes wondered if her memories would ever return. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. What mattered more, she realized, was that she had survived whatever happened, even if she didn't consciously remember how. Somewhere in that lost time, a version of her had found a way to keep going. That strength still lived in her, even if the story behind it was hidden. The woman who vanished across state lines had come back with no memory, but she had not come back empty. She had come back with resilience she didn't fully understand, with instincts that had once kept her alive, and with the chance to build a life that was not defined solely by what she had lost. The mystery of her missing time remained, unresolved and heavy, but it no longer owned her future. Emily moved forward, carrying the silence of her past not as a prison, but as a reminder that even when memory is taken, the will to live, to grow, and to begin again can survive in its place.